Good. I think that's all of the announcements and things of that nature. So, it is, I always like to give a word of encouragement of some sort, when we come to the end of the year. And I remember one time, in talking about the end of the year and so on, we had someone who was, at that time, very much upset and against any kind of recognition of the pagan. But then I just said, well, you write checks, right? You go from December 31st to January 1st. It'll be okay. It'll be all right. All right? He who is in us is greater than he who is in the world. All right? And so I think that it is it's a turning of a page. And it does, I think, help sometimes when we're thinking about relinquishing past, moving forward to the future, and things like that. I was sharing with Jared yesterday about, I'll just call a Beth Messiah past, right? Like 1,000 years ago, or before the days of Noah, at Beth Messiah. We used to have a New Year. We called them all tea houses, right? We every month go to somebody's house for. That's how big Beth Messiah was. The whole congregation could go to somebody's house, I remember table tennis tournaments and picnics and other, fun things, really just building the fellowship, it was really, really very, very nice. Well, at the end of the year, I just remember going to Betty's house. I don't know if it was elsewhere, but I just remember Betty's house, going for New Year's. And we do a really kind of a nice thing, and I would recommend it, maybe if a friends get together or a chavurah group or whatever. And that is just before 12 o'clock, we would have Messiah's table. And starting at 10 of or 5 of. And then praying and partaking of the elements and so on and singing a song. And then it would be, when we're done, it would be the new year. And very poignant and very special. So that's a great memory of our past, but that would be kind of a fun thing to do, I think, sometime, or even for yourself, if you're with your family or with others, kind of a nice thing. And so, we are living in a time where there's so many dark clouds all over the place. I will say from October 7th to now, it seems like years have gone by, personally. To me, it doesn't feel like, oh, wow, I can't believe it's all this, 3 months already, almost. It seems like an eternity for me and my family and others as well. And just when you're thinking, well, are they going to turn a corner? Is it going to get better? It just keeps getting worse. It just seems to keep getting worse on different levels, And then not only that, but other things in our world. Believe it or not, there are troubling places in other parts of the earth. Believe it or not. And it doesn't seem to be getting any better in all of the anti-Jewish activity taking place. It really is not on the back burner, even though you may not see it on whatever news source you watch or listen to. Even if it's not on the first story anymore, It is, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as we are concerned. And then, of course, all the culture things that go on, and all just a lot of different things. I think that there's a real need for a word of hope, and I will just say we have that word of hope. By the way, that this is a great opportunity of sharing a great word of hope, and that we don't just be like everybody else and wring our hands and shake our heads and say, wow, everything's just horrible and bad, and that's the end of it. It's not the end of it. And we do have a great word of hope to share, but first we need to make sure we have it, that we're, it's on our heart, not just on a theological doctrinal statement or a class on end-time prophecy or something, but that we really recognize real hope, because when you have hope and you live hope, it changes the way you frame everything, and it changes the way you relate to people as well. So we're at the end of Genesis in our reading cycle, and last week and this week are the two great portions where Joseph first he reveals himself to his brothers, and I love that. It's like I've been here long enough that my face has changed. Look carefully, it's me, right? And they're plotting, as we would say in Yiddish, like dying, like, oh no, how could this be? It's like, this is our worst nightmare now come true, that we're going to die. And of course, Joseph says, now, wait, right? Don't be afraid. Okay, God sent me ahead of you to prepare a remnant. Joseph has such a worldview, to prepare a remnant, not just to save our skins as a family, but to prepare a remnant in the earth. That's what he says in chapter 45. So he has a really a covenantal view of that. So he's able to see far beyond the actual events of his own life, and he recognizes that it's not about himself or his personal experience. And then, of course, you have at the end of the book, you have the great verse in verse 20 of chapter 50 that we heard about today, 19 and 20. Do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. So therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. So he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. And of course, now this is after Dad's gone, right? After Jacob is dead. And the brothers who are still they're talking about this. They're still experiencing like guilt. They can't get past it themselves, which is another story for another day, because they're still talking about it. Now that Jacob is dead, now what is Joseph going to do? Maybe now he's going to really get us. Because that's human nature, right? Human nature is, I'll forgive you after I beat you up. Or, I'll forgive you after I get a pound of flesh. Or I'll forgive you after I kill you. But first I must kill you. Then I will forgive you. Right? That's how we think. That is how we think in our world. To this day. We see what's happening in our world. But so Joseph here, he not only lets them off the hook. This is a great illustration of forgiveness, that he speaks kindly to them. He tells them more than once, don't be afraid. And then he says, I will provide. Not only, he could have said, I suppose, don't be afraid, I'm not going to kill you. Adios. But he says, I will provide for you and your little ones. See? And he speaks kindly to them. This is real forgiveness in action. Really, real forgiveness in action. It's not just words, it's a way of life. Now, the story of Joseph is 13 chapters long, right? It's longer than Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, really, those stories. And of course, we know that it's not just about Joseph. It's about, as it says at the beginning of chapter 37, these are the generations of the sons of Jacob, told in a story form of the story or life of Joseph, right? And so what do we learn in this passage? We learn about really Israel's future. That there was going to be problems among brothers, right? There's going to be problems among brothers to the degree that there would end up being a split of the kingdom. And there would actually be two kingdoms of Israel. One called Israel, one called Judah, later Judea, right? And so we read about that. We also read about interaction with foreign nations. Interaction with foreign nations. And that is really very interesting. And then, of course, at the end, we're reading about unity. We read about reconciliation, right? And if you read the stories of brothers carefully in Bereshit, there you have reconciliation in all of them. And that is an important message. That Ishmael and Isaac, they come together. Jacob and Esau, seemingly, come together. And all of the sons of Jacob are reconciled at the end of the book. And then, of course, the Haftorah portion, I think it was from last week, was from Ezekiel 37, right? After the dry bones, after the resurrection of Israel, you have the two sticks. And you read about Joseph and you read about Judah coming together. The unification of the people of Israel. And it is when you have this, and so this is prophetic, really, of the future, of a complete unification of Israel under the kingship of God. And of course now in Messiah Yeshua, this will bring blessing to the entire world, as Paul talks about in Romans chapter 11. Absolutely, amen. And so in this narrative, there's something else, and this is what is, I think, such a great word of encouragement, and where we're going to go right now from here. And that is when Joseph tells his brothers that that he's not going to kill them, and don't worry, don't be afraid, and so on. And then even all the way at the very end, when you have this great statement at the end of Genesis, that Joseph never complains about the specific hardships that he went through. Like he never says, let me tell you about Potiphar. This was no picnic, brothers. Now, I know God meant it for good and all that, but let me tell you what it was like. While you were back there, I was here. Yes, thank God it's all worked out, and now I can see it. No, he never talks about being in jail, and then about wanting to, having the expectation that he's going to get out, and then he's still stuck there. And then he finally gets out, and just we see, his whole journey story. Joseph recognizes that his calling makes his suffering pale in comparison. That the sufferings, yes, were real. We read about them in the narrative. We read about them in the story. But he doesn't dwell on them. He doesn't focus on them. He doesn't even, in the text anyway, tell his brothers about them. because he understands that it is a much bigger story than about himself and about his own personal current events. And I think that is a very important point for us. We're always living in the middle of current events. I mean, when you come to an end of a year, couldn't we say, when is a year when we couldn't say, well, it was like the best of times and the worst of times? What year isn't like that? What year doesn't have highs and lows? What year doesn't have tragedies? What year, doesn't have all of this? It's just, and sometimes we'll say it's never been like this. You live long enough, it's been like this, okay? We may experience things differently, but this is life before the consummation, life before the Messianic kingdom. But from time to time, we need an infusion of hope. And I think that we have one here, because we're living in days that are filled with terrible things, just filled with terrible things. But we need to realize that, it's kind of like Joseph, that, there's something bigger going on. And there's always something bigger going on because God is moving history forward. And it's all part of his history in one way or another, right? And we don't have to understand it. But we lean on the Lord and we trust God. And, in this life, there are things, there are choices, and there are things we must do and that are, not pleasant and whatever it may be. But how helpful it is to have this attitude of Joseph. That what you or the world may mean for evil, God is moving forward, and there's meaning and significance in the way that I react and handle myself. Just like Joseph, he could have reacted very differently to all of these circumstances, right? Yet he has his eye on God. So, as some of you know, I just finished teaching a short course on Micah, an MJTI short course on Micah. And I've done this before, at MSI, and even gave a synopsis of it in a series of messages. But something struck me this time around, and isn't it great about that, about studying and reading the Bible? There's always something that's going to strike you differently. And probably it may have to do with the events going on in Israel, probably. But it struck me differently. So it was interesting because the name of the course, I did not name the course, but it was named The Magnificence of Micah. The Magnificence of Micah. Now, Micah's a great prophet. The size of a prophetic word or book is not relevant to its importance, right? And as the students learned, that Micah played a role in Jeremiah's life, and that was 100 years later, approximately 100 years later, after Micah's day. Also, he was a contemporary with Isaiah, and there are some very similar passages in Micah and Isaiah, which probably came from either a common source, meaning the revelation of God, or a common source of some sort. I don't think it was so much one. I got it from Isaiah. I don't think that's how that worked. But when you read Micah carefully, you realize that the majority of the book is what I call adjudication. The majority of the book is about judgment. Is about sin and judgment, the corruption of civil leaders and prophets, and the corruption of the priesthood, and the corruption of the people, which led to alienation. which led to isolation, which led to complete mistrust. And it's all in this book. Certainly you could read it and say, wow, it's talking about today. Well, at the very end of chapter 3, you have this a real low point. At the very end of chapter 3, it says, therefore, on account of you, Zion will be plowed as a field. Jerusalem will become a heap of ruins. And the mountain of the temple will become high places of a forest. In other words, it's like plowed under. It's going to disappear because of all of this sin. Well, this doesn't sound very magnificent, but then you read at the beginning of chapter 4, and it will come about after the days. Literally, it's after the days, not as in the last days, but after the days. Where now you have a complete reversal of fortune, a complete reversal of what these words of judgment are. But there's also something to notice, not just simply a reversal of judgment. It will come about after these days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and the peoples will stream to it. And many nations will come and say, and you know this, like from Isaiah chapter 2, but here it is in Micah chapter 4. Come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us about his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For from Zion will go forth the Torah, even the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he will judge between many peoples and render decisions for mighty distant nations. That they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they train for war. Each of them will sit under his vine and under his fig tree, and with no one to make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. Very interesting. In the here it is, TLV, in the Tree of Life version, when it says, each man will sit under his vine, under his fig tree, with no one causing terror. Wow. It kind of jumps out at you, with no one causing terror. Those are words for us of great hope, but it's really radical hope. And here's why. It's not just a reversal of fortune. Usually when we think about, the end or what God is going to do after those days, it's going to be the enemies will all die and Israel will live. The judgment will take finally, judgment will come upon all the nations, and Israel will be restored. But that's not what this says. That's not what this says. There is going to be a transformation of nations. A transformation not only of nations. When you read here about peoples and nations, Micah's not thinking, even though it didn't exist yet, but rhetorically speaking, he wasn't thinking about Canada or the United States or Mexico or Argentina or England or France. He was thinking about the Assyrians and the Egyptians and everybody in between. The nations that are going to plow Jerusalem under, the day will come when they will be transformed. That is a radical word of hope. That is a radical word of hope. So he says here, people groups will stream to Jerusalem. Interesting, in the Second Temple period, you had Jews from all over, of course, like we read the Psalms of Ascent, right? Coming to Jerusalem. But now, the way Micah is saying it, it's not only Jews, but nations, our enemies, are going to be transformed, and they're going to actually come to Jerusalem, not to destroy, but to come under the kingship of the God of Israel. Wow. Right? What a word for today. Then we read again here, many nations will come and say, let us come and go up to the house of the Lord, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. In other words, it's not saying, this is not about, now we're going to celebrate all the festivals, or we're going to, take on the trappings of a Jewish lifestyle or something like that. No, he's saying that the nations are going to embrace a Torah way of life, the ethics and morals of God. For from Zion will go forth the Torah, even the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And then not only not only are they going to come to Jerusalem, but in this transformation of nations, an amazing thing is going to happen. Remember I said a little while ago that, Israel is not the only place where things are taking place in this world. There are terrible things happening in many different nations, where horrible things that, of course, neither the news or anyone else seems to care about. But it says here, he will judge between many peoples and will render decisions for mighty distant nations. That means that, not everything is about Jews and Gentiles. The Gentile world is huge, you haven't noticed, right? And has all kinds of people groups in it. All kinds of nations who war against nations. You have many nations that cause their own people to suffer tremendously in many parts of the world. But here, what's going to happen is that in this transformation of nations are going to come under the crown of the King of Israel. They're going to maintain their identities. Clearly, they're called nations. They're going to, and that's part of the glory of it. I remember a number of years ago, Dr. David Rudolph was here and was talking about a transformation of cultures. So that was really quite fascinating. A transformation of cultures. Like, cultural, every people group has different cultures. And that God will redeem the cultures of not just their lives and their hearts, but the cultures of people, all to be focused on the Lord. And so faraway nations on every continent are going to yield to the Lord, and he will bring peace between all kinds of people to the place where there'll be no need for machinery of war. But there'll be a lot of need for farming equipment, right? And the machinery of war will turn into farming equipment. And what a thought that is. That there will be this transformation of people groups, and a transformation of nations. This is a radical hope, just as much as the hope of Joseph, suffering through varieties of things, knowing that the end result was going to be redemption of his brothers, of himself, and of nations. And he had his eye on that hope, and it really transformed his response to these things. And this hope needs to transform our response as well. Now, this passage goes further. Now, in verse 6 of chapter 4, now he's going to address Israel. He's addressing the nations. And it's fascinating that the first thing he talks about after those days is a transformation of nations. Now, he's going to talk about the ingathering of Israel, the ingathering of the people. Now, what does he say in that day? In verse 6 declares the Lord, I will assemble the lame and gather the outcasts, even those I have afflicted. Of course, if you read the other parts of Micah, you see the ramifications of great sin, right? Even those I have afflicted. And I will make the lame a remnant, and the outcasts a strong nation. And the Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion from now on and forever. And as for you, tower of the flock, hill of the daughter of Zion, to you it will come. Even the former dominion will come, the kingdom of the daughter of Jerusalem. Basically, he's saying, so there's going to be this transformation of nations, but you, my people who are hurting, who have suffered, who have been in exile, you're going to return. And it's interesting, you have this phrase, the tower of the flock. Of course, you read about the king of Israel being called really the shepherd king in Micah, and Jerusalem, the city, is sort of like the shepherd city. Is like the pen for the sheep, and it will have its former dominion. Okay, all well and good, right? Okay. Well, now Micah comes back. Well, now we got to come back to the present, because you're not feeling it, are you, my people? Right? Because then we read, now, why do you cry out loudly? Is there no king among you? Or has your counselor perished? Meaning you have kings and you have counselors. Are they helping? Remember, if you've ever taken many moons ago, when I used to teach an MSI course on the prophets and the historical books, right? What is the theme of Kings? Failure. Failure, right? And always looking forward to the future king. So that you have here. And so now, why do you cry out loudly? Is there no king among you? Or has your counselor perished? That agony has gripped you like a woman in childbirth? Writhe and labor to give birth, daughter of Zion, like a woman in childbirth. For now you will go out of this city, dwell in the field, go to Babylon. There you will be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies. And now many nations have been assembled against you, who say, let her be polluted, and let our eyes gloat over Zion. But they do not know the thoughts of the Lord, and they do not understand his purpose, for he has gathered them like sheaves to the threshing floor. And so what you have here is an acknowledgement from the prophet that times are tough now. Now, this is an amazing passage going in chapter 4, going into chapter 5. Jewish scholars from antiquity, our rabbinic scholars, all, except for a very small minority, I believe this is all about King Messiah, the Messianic age, when the Messiah comes. But between now and when the Messiah comes is going to be hardship, is going to be great difficulty. And to all, when we read here about Babylon and we read about Assyria and what they're doing now, that the reality is that when our people returned from the Babylonian exile, it was like a small e. That there was a return, but it was a small number. It wasn't Jewish people from everywhere, and there was not a real a tremendous spiritual renewal. There was of sorts. But the truth is that these nations represent all empires, and that labor pains continue. If you're familiar with the Gospel of Matthew, in the 24th chapter, right, when he's talking about future events regarding Jerusalem and the temple and all of that, he says, you're going to hear about wars and rumors of wars. false prophets, etc. But this is just the beginning of birth pains. He is simply echoing what the prophets are saying here. I laugh when you read people today that, well, there's wars and there's rumors of wars. This must be it. When has there not been wars and rumors of wars? In human history. When has there been peacetime in human history? There have been wars and rumors of wars is one of the most visible, horrific signs of rebellion against God from the beginning, from the fall of Adam and Eve. And that's why there's so much emphasis on peace at the end, right? So here he's acknowledging that, and we need to understand that when it comes to, now he's speaking to Israel, there's always going to be birth pains, now I have never given birth to a child. I just wanted you to know that, right? But I have been up close, real close, for 3, okay? And we don't need to talk about kidney stones, right? Right, gentlemen, right? Yikes. Okay, so the point is it is painful. It is painful. Now they had, in Micah's day, the hope of the coming of the Messiah. Yes, we have the Messiah, but not the consummation, so we're still kind of in that place of looking forward, but living with labor pain, living with pain and agony. And right now, boy, that pain and agony is up front and personal. But we need to live in this radical hope. But you know what he's not done? He says something else here. If you go into chapter 5, or the end of chapter 4, depending on what translation you have. Now muster yourselves in troops, daughter of troops, which is an interesting translation. It can be translated in several different ways. But any way you translate this, the way you understand the Hebrew and roots of words and so on, is that it is a painful time. The muster yourselves in troops, daughter in troops, could also be translated, believe it or not, cut yourselves, O daughter of troops. Believe it or not. They have laid siege against us. With a rod they will smite the ruler of Israel on the cheek. Meaning that, gather we're at war. Recognize we're at war. They've laid a siege against us. But these are bad times. But then in verse 2, you have but. As for you, Bethlehem Ephratah, meaning, as for you, Bethlehem, and make sure you got the right Bethlehem, because it is the Bethlehem where Jesse from the Ephrat is from. That's the point of it. It's not a play on words about being little. Okay? It is saying this is Bethlehem, where David is from, where Jesse is from, that Bethlehem. Okay? Get it right. Too little to be among the clans of Judah. From you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. And so this great statement that out of Bethlehem is going to be born one in the ancient dynasty of David. Going back to the ancient dynasty of David. I'm going to suggest that from days of eternity is not a good proof text to talk about the eternality of the Messiah. Okay? That it's really from antiquity, from days of old. It's poetry, and it is reiterating what long ago is. It's days of eternity. And so in this week's Torah portion, right, you have the promise of the dynasty of David in its embryonic form from Judah, right? The king is going to come over, the Messianic king is going to be born from Judah. And then the story of David and the covenant that God makes with David, promising him a dynasty that will last forever. And that's the point of this passage. The Davidic king, the Davidic shepherd king, is going to come. Not yet in this passage, but going to come. Therefore, he will give them up. See, he's reiterating this difficult time period. Until the time when she who is in labor has borne a child. Then the remainder of his brethren will return to the sons of Israel. Speaking of the unification of Joseph and Judah. And he will arise and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they will remain, because at that time he will be great to the ends of the earth. And then look what it says in the very next line. And this one will be shalom. This one will be, and in my translation here in italics to help in the English, this one will be our peace. Does that sound familiar? It should, because I think somewhere in Ephesians, somewhere around chapter 2, somewhere around verse 14, we read that the nations who were far off have been brought near, and Messiah Yeshua is our peace. Here you have it, and what Micah is talking about is how this is going to manifest in the whole world. How this is going to manifest in the whole world. And it's really very interesting because, just to continue here, when the Assyrians invade our land, when he tramples on our citadels, then we will raise up against him 7 shepherds and 8 leaders of men. And they will shepherd the land of Assyria with the sword, the land of Nimrod at its entrance, and so on. And it's really very interesting. Do you remember at Hanukkah, I mentioned this, that in the original Ma'otzur, that was written more like closer to the Middle Ages than the 19th century, that the Hebrew words are different than the English words that we sing. And there's like 8 stanzas, and at the very, very end, looking forward to the 7 shepherds, like the Maccabees, right? And so, very interesting that at that time they understood that, this story of the Maccabees, right? God showed great grace and great mercy, and they, quote unquote, did God's bidding. They reclaimed Jerusalem, they cleansed the temple, and they dedicated the temple. And so, very interestingly, perhaps as foreshadowing of the ultimate future, it's speaking of Israel's destiny, that when this happens, when this one born in Bethlehem comes as king and has the authority in this world of his kingdom, and he's going to gather in Israel to his kingdom, and there'll be a transformation of nations, that Israel will fulfill her destiny of being Messiah Yeshua's emissaries in this world. And then we read here in verse 7, then the remnant of Jacob will be among many peoples, like dew from the Lord, like showers on vegetation, which do not wait for men or delay for the sons of men. And so Israel will be a blessing to the nations. In that day, Israel will be a blessing to the nations. And then we read, and the remnant of Jacob will be among the nations, among the peoples, like a lion among the beasts of the forest, like a young lion among the flocks, and so on. There, meaning that Israel will not only be a blessing to the nations, but will serve as agents of judgment, evidently, upon the nations. And so the point being here is that, yes, there is this great hope for the future, this transformation of nations, the regathering of Israel. He'll be the peace among nations. It says Jacob will dwell among the nations, right? And so you're not going to have like nation states like we have today. It's not going to be like that. Countries, As we might use that terminology. It'll be people groups, including the Jewish people, restored Jewish people in Israel, who will all be one and will be worshiping the King. Now we know that Messiah, Yeshua, has indeed come. And we know that from Matthew chapter 2, he was born in Bethlehem. He was born in Bethlehem. And he is indeed the Messianic King. And we know that today the kingdom is an invisible kingdom. An invisible kingdom. I don't like to use spiritual. This is spiritual, right, what we see here. But the invisible form of this kingdom with its center in the heavenlies, as we read in Ephesians and Colossians and elsewhere, where Yeshua is seated, so to speak, at the right hand of the Father, right? Yes, and all who embrace him are part of this restored Davidic kingdom of God as brothers and sisters in Messiah, right? And that's why it's so important for us to retain our nationalities or our ethnicities. That's a better word. Our ethnicities and all of that, because we need to demonstrate in this dark world what it's going to look like. We are becoming attractions, right? But in reality, today. And this is a message of hope that we need to be living and that we need to be sharing. We are living in a world with very little hope. We need to have in our demeanor and in our conversation this sense of, wow, why are you so hopeful? Look around you. And certainly regarding, Israel and the Palestinians and Gaza and everything, how could there be hope? Well, let me tell you about the hope. And let me tell you how the King of Israel has broken in to this world. You don't start with, you're a sinner separated from God. Most people can't understand any of that terminology. Don't even understand what you're talking about. But you talk about peace and well-being, and you talk about what we experience as a community, not isolated, but communally. That speaks to this world. And that is a great message that we have. Because indeed, when it talks here about Israel will dwell among the nations, and there'll be the dew and so on, we need to be a blessing. We need to speak truth amongst ourselves, but we need to demonstrate what this great future is when he is called our peace. Yeshua is the shepherd king of Israel. And whether people embrace him or not, he is the shepherd king of Israel. And he is the one who transforms nations. He is the one who transforms the Jewish people. He is the one who does this work. So we need to be, yes, we live in this world, and unfortunately, we are sucked into the affairs of this world by simply living in it, clearly. Yet at the very same time, we need to be purveyors of peace, purveyors of shalom to this world in Messiah Yeshua. We must not get sucked into the quicksand, but we need to, as I like to say, stay above the fray and be able to offer great words of hope. So just in closing, I love, I'm just going to mention, I'm not even going to turn there, I love Psalm 90, at this time of year, where basically the psalm says, boy, life comes, life goes, everything seems to remain the same, and nothing seems to be getting any better. Lord, teach us to number our days so that we may present to you a heart of wisdom, or get a heart of wisdom. And then at the other end of that prayer, the end of that prayer is, Lord, establish or confirm the work of our hands. Yes, establish the work of our hands. In other words, regardless of wherever we may be in life today, May we carry this radical hope with radical yieldedness to God, with radical obedience to God. And may we pray, Lord, make every day of my life count, whether I am 85 or 15 or whatever it is. Make every day of my life count. May I be able to not only get a heart of wisdom, but present a heart of wisdom. And may the works of my hands make a difference in this troubled world in which we live. And so may we enter into this new year with a radical hope and a radical vision and a radical yieldedness to God. And may it bear fruit for his kingdom. Let's pray.